Before we get into the real heart of this story, let's take the next minute to confront a question that has bothered historians, reenactors, and survivalists for over a century. How did soldiers in the First World War stay alive in winters so brutal that even the locals struggled? The Western Front was a place where frostbite could claim fingers in a matter of hours, where trenches filled with ice, where uniforms froze rigid, and where rest was often taken in mud that barely passed for solid ground. Yet, despite all of this, tens of thousands of men from different nations carried with them a single insulating layer that kept them warm through nights that would have destroyed most modern camping gear. It wasn't wool, it wasn't fur, and it wasn't any kind of sleeping bag. It was a piece of equipment far simpler, far tougher, and far more overlooked. And the deeper you look into the field reports, the more you realize that this was one of the quiet triumphs of WWI engineering, one that modern outdoor enthusiasts have strangely forgotten. The true secret of WWI warmth came from a layered felt system, not bulky bedding. Long before synthetic insulation existed, armies had to rely on materials that trapped heat through density rather than fluff. The British, French, and German forces all issued versions of a thick, felted ground layer, often called a trench blanket, a ground sheet, or a felted mat, depending on the army. What made it extraordinary was the combination of compression, density, and water resistance. Unlike fur, which loses insulating power when wet, or wool blankets, which become heavy and slow to dry, this felted mat relied on thousands of tightly interlocked fibres, pressed so firmly that cold air had difficulty penetrating even when moisture was present. Soldiers placed it beneath their bodies instead of over them, and this was the key. Heat was preserved not by piling layers on top, but by preventing the cold earth from draining warmth from below. Field diaries from the time describe men choosing the felt mat over any available blanket, because nothing else blocked the brutal transfer of cold like that compressed layer did. A modern equivalent would be a wool fibre pressing or a dense felt saddle pad, both of which use the same principle: insulation born from resistance, not thickness. The felt layer succeeded because it solved the single biggest enemy of trench survival: ground chill. Modern outdoor culture often focuses on wind, snow and rainfall, but WWI soldiers learned that the most dangerous cold came from the earth itself. Wet soil pulls heat from the human body faster than ice, and trenches were almost always saturated. The felt ground layer worked because it created a barrier that refused to compress under body weight. Unlike straw or loose bedding, which flattened almost instantly, the felt mat maintained its loft and density even after weeks of use. German units were known to cut theirs into fitted mats for dugouts, while French troops sometimes stitched two mats together to create a full-length ground barrier. This wasn't luxury, it was survival engineering. If you want to test this principle today, you can replicate it by placing a dense wool felt layer under your sleeping platform during cold season camping. Even a thin 10 to 12 mm felt panel will outperform many lightweight sleeping pads in sheer warmth retention. This is the core secret. Warmth comes from stopping heat loss downward before trying to preserve heat upward. The material worked because World War I engineers designed it to withstand constant moisture. The trenches were, honestly, the worst possible environment for traditional bedding. Everything was wet, everything was muddy, everything was exposed to freezing nights, followed by thawing mornings. Canvas just rotted. Wool, well, it took on water. Leather stiffened, but felted fibre, when compressed and chemically treated, resisted moisture in a way soldiers came to trust. The fibres were boiled, shrunk, and bonded so tightly that water couldn't easily travel through the material. Even when the surface became damp, the internal density prevented saturation. When troops bedded down, their body heat dried the top layer, while the bottom layer stayed cold but stable. This is almost identical to what happens when you wear boiled wool garments in freezing weather. They insulate even when damp because the fibre network prevents full penetration of moisture. If you are engaged in long-term outdoor work or, say, designing a cold-weather shelter, incorporating a moisture-resistant insulating layer on the floor, especially one based on felted or boiled fibres, will give you a foundation far more dependable than synthetic pads that become brittle or lose structure over time. The simplicity of the World War I felt layer made it more reliable than later sleeping bag designs. When sleeping bags became standard issue decades later, they solved one problem but created another. They trapped heat well, but they compressed underneath you, losing insulation exactly where it was most needed. The World War I felt mat never failed at its job because it had only one job stop conductive heat loss. A single mat, still warm after days of mud and cold, was more dependable than a multilayer sleeping bag that flattened and absorbed moisture. Survival instructors today often rediscover this principle when teaching cold weather techniques. A thick insulating ground barrier matters more than the insulation above your body. Add a wool blanket or cloak on top, and you create a system astonishingly close to what troops used in the trenches. The method is simple to replicate. Lay down your insulating mat first, then any canvas or waterproof barrier, and finish with your warmth layer. This creates a three-part system that mirrors World War I trench practice: insulation against the earth, moisture management above it, and personal warmth at the top. The endurance of this design shows that forgotten solutions often outperform modern gear. Collectors and reenactors occasionally come across original World War I mats stored for over a century, and, well, many of them remain functional. They may show staining or surface wear, but the internal structure still insulates. This reveals a subtle but important truth about wartime engineering. Durability was built into the material, not added afterward. When you compress fibres under heat and moisture, you create a structure that can survive neglect, storage, and repeated abuse. The fact that a soldier could rely on the same mat through an entire winter campaign says more about the brilliance of early 20th century material science than any romanticized myth about tougher men. The equipment itself was engineered for hardship, and the techniques behind it are just as useful today. If you appreciate deep explorations of forgotten technologies, the survival methods of our ancestors, and the practical lessons these old designs still offer, make sure you subscribe and share this episode. There is, honestly, a lot more to uncover in the stories these artifacts still carry.